Welcome to a deep dive into a really fascinating document. It's the IWGIA Yearbook 1987. Um, it's a time capsule, basically,
Sure.
full of glimpses into the lives and struggles of indigenous peoples all over the world over 3 decades ago.
And while 1987 might feel like a lifetime ago, I mean, think big hair, shoulder pads, the Berlin Wall still standing. The issues that are raised in this yearbook, they're anything but dated. We're going to uncover some pretty shocking events, but also some really inspiring stories of resilience that, still resonate today.
Definitely. And that's what makes this so fascinating. It's not just a history lesson. It's an opportunity to understand how these struggles from the past, how they continue to shape the present. So buckle up, because the yearbook, it doesn't hold back. I mean, the introduction, it paints a pretty stark picture right from the get-go.
Yeah, the opening pages, they just hit you with this wave of alarming statistics. They estimate that around 30,000 indigenous people were dying every year from violence alone. And countless more, they were succumbing to, neglect and starvation. They estimate that there were something like 5 million indigenous refugees globally. I mean, it's a sobering reality check right from the start.
Yeah, it definitely sets the stage for a heavy but really important conversation. So how does it approach this massive topic? I mean, where do they even begin?
Well, it's structured kind of like a journey across the globe, with reports from different regions highlighting the diverse experiences of indigenous peoples. And woven throughout these individual stories are these recurring themes that keep popping up, like
Mhm.
land rights, self-determination, environmental destruction, and the fight for cultural survival.
Timeless
Yep.
struggles, unfortunately. Okay, well, let's start our exploration in North America. What was this situation like, closer to home back in '87?
Well, up in the Canadian Arctic, you see the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, and they're taking a really proactive approach to conservation. They were developing this strategy that was focused on sustainable resource development, which was pretty forward thinking for the time.
That's interesting. It seems like the Inuit were already recognizing the importance of balancing, economic development with environmental protection, which is a concept that become even more crucial today.
Absolutely. But it wasn't all positive developments in North America. Indigenous peoples in several Canadian provinces, they were facing intense pushback against their rights. There were ongoing battles for land ownership and even basic needs. The Haida people of Haida Gwaii, for instance, they were locked in this struggle with logging companies that were just decimating their forests.
A stark reminder that the fight for environmental justice, it has deep roots. What about the situation in the USA? Was it a similar story?
In many ways, yes. The yearbook highlights the persistent poverty, health problems, and unemployment that was plaguing indigenous communities in the U.S. And get this, despite this dire situation, the U.S. government was actually cutting back on health services and planning to close Indian schools. It's almost unbelievable.
Instead of addressing these systemic issues, they were pulling resources away. I
Mhm.
mean, what does that tell you about the government's attitude towards indigenous communities at the time?
It speaks volumes about their priorities, doesn't it? And sadly, it's a pattern that we see repeated throughout history and even today.
It's a stark reminder that progress, it isn't always linear. Were there any other issues that stood out in the North American reports?
Both the US and Canada were grappling with the plight of Indigenous prisoners. The yearbook, it shines a light on the lack of religious freedom and cultural support in many prisons, which further highlights the systemic discrimination that Indigenous people were facing.
So even behind bars, they were facing cultural erasure. It's a really disheartening reality. Okay, let's shift our focus south to Central America and Mexico. What's the headline from that region in 1987?
Well, in Mexico, 1987 was the year of hunger strikes. There were two powerful acts of protest that really captured the nation's attention.
Now, this sounds like a story. Tell me more about these hunger strikes. What were they fighting for?
Well, one hunger strike was demanding the release of jailed indigenous activists and the recognition of land rights. And the other one was this desperate plea for attention to the acute land problem in Mexico and the ongoing violence that was directed at indigenous communities.
It seems like this land issue is a common thread across so many regions. Did the yearbook provide any specific examples of these land conflicts?
Absolutely. They mention the Huastec people who were being forced off their ancestral lands, the killing of an activist named Francisco Yescas Francisco, and the relentless harassment of the El Pipila community. It's just this heartbreaking catalog of injustice. And perhaps most tragically, the yearbook reports that 18 indigenous nations in Mexico, they were on the verge of extinction.
It's a stark reminder of just how high the stakes were. So what about the rest of Central America? What else jumps out from the yearbook?
Well, Guatemala was still reeling from the devastating effects of its civil war, particularly the impact on the Mayan population. The yearbook details the ongoing displacement, massacres, and militarization that plagued their communities.
Another tragic and all too familiar story of indigenous peoples caught in the crossfire of conflict. Were there any stories of resilience amidst all this turmoil?
Absolutely. There were communities that were finding refuge in the mountains. And there are these powerful stories of those who had been displaced, trying to rebuild their lives and their communities. It's a testament to the strength and resilience of the Mayan people.
It sounds like there were also some troubling land issues brewing in Belize.
Yeah, the government was planning to survey and parcel land within Mayan reserved areas, which raised fears that this precious land would end up being sold off. The Toledo Maya Cultural Council, they were fighting back, demanding communal title to their ancestral homeland.
A fight that continues in many parts of the world today. What about El Salvador? Were there similar challenges there?
Unfortunately, yes. Indigenous peoples in El Salvador, they were facing dire threats to their lands and their organizations. The yearbook, it mentions a case where soldiers involved in the Las Hojas massacre, where something like 74 indigenous farmers were reportedly killed. They were given reprieve. And on top of that, the government was actively trying to dismantle indigenous land tenure and putting immense pressure on the indigenous organization, ANIS.
It's a pattern we see all too often. Powerful forces working to silence and disempower indigenous communities. Before we move on to South America, can you tell us about the situation in Honduras and Nicaragua?
Yeah. The Mosquitia region was a focal point of conflict in 1987. The Mosquitu and Sumu peoples, they found themselves trapped in the crossfire of the Nicaraguan conflict, facing forced recruitment by the Contras and widespread human rights violations.
So yet again, indigenous communities were bearing the brunt of political turmoil. It seems like Central America was a powder keg in '87.
Yeah, it was a turbulent time for the region. And as we'll see as we move south to South America, the fight for indigenous rights, it continues, often with even more intensity.
Well, on that note, let's dive into South America. What's our first stop on this leg of the journey?
We begin in Venezuela, where we find the Bari and Yucpa nations struggling with a range of health problems. The Yucpa were dealing with a hepatitis outbreak, while the Bari continued to face land incursions by colonists. And then there's the Yanomami, who were facing a resurgence of tourism despite the devastating effects of past tourism in the 1970s.
It's frustrating to see this cycle of exploitation repeating itself.
Yeah.
What about Colombia? Were there similar stories of exploitation and violence there?
The situation in Colombia was particularly dire. The yearbook reports the shocking killing of over 40 Embera Indians in a conflict over gold mining rights. The police and military were implicated in the killings, claiming they mistook the Ember for guerrillas. And in another incident, 4 indigenous people from Cauca were killed by police during a fiesta.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the casual brutality of these acts. It's heartbreaking.
It's difficult to even read about, even decades later, and sadly, as we'll see in the next country, these weren't isolated incidents.
All right, lead the way. Where are we headed next?
Ecuador, where a devastating earthquake struck the Amazon region. While oil companies received swift assistance from the government, the response to indigenous communities was delayed, highlighting the stark disparities in how they were treated. There was also the tragic killing of missionaries by Huaorani fighters, a consequence of the ongoing encroachment of oil companies on Huaorani lands.
It seems like in times of crisis, indigenous communities are often the last to receive help. It's a disturbing pattern.
It speaks volumes about the power dynamics at play. Speaking of power, let's move on to Peru. There's more positive development here. The World Bank was actually supporting land titling efforts for indigenous communities, which was a step in the right direction.
That sounds promising. Was it all good news in Peru?
Not entirely. The struggle for resources continued, with the yearbook mentioning an Aguaruna person being shot in a conflict over gold mining concessions and an Amarcari youth killed by colonists on their land. So while there were some positive steps being taken, the underlying issues of land conflict and exploitation persisted.
It seems like even when there's progress, those tensions over land and resources, they just keep bubbling to the surface. Where to next?
Bolivia, where the murder of several Yuki people living between the Icalo and Yapacani rivers sent shockwaves through the country. Hunters and lumber companies were suspected, adding another layer to the complex web of exploitation happening in the Amazon.
It's a bleak picture. Were there any glimmers of hope in South America in '87?
Chile and Argentina were mourning the death of Aim Payne, a Mapuche singer and activist. But amidst the grief, there was also action. A new national indigenous organization was forming in Argentina, a sign that people were determined to continue the fight for their rights.
It's inspiring to see that spirit of resistance, even in the face of such loss.
Exactly. And while indigenous communities in Argentina were facing ongoing challenges like, land loss and lack of basic services, the formation of this new organization, it offered a glimmer of hope. It suggested a growing movement for change and a more unified voice for indigenous peoples.
It seems like we're seeing the emergence of a more organized and powerful indigenous rights movement on a global scale.
You're absolutely right. And as we'll see as we journey across the Pacific, that spirit of collective action, it's burning brightly in many parts of the world.
Okay, I'm ready to cross the ocean. What awaits us in the Pacific?
Our first stop is Hawaii, where Native Hawaiians had achieved a major victory. They had just passed a national constitution.
Wow, that's huge. A major step towards self-determination.
It was a significant achievement, but the fight for sovereignty, it was far from over. They were still facing serious threats from development and militarization, particularly from the Japanese construction company Kumagai and the U.S. government, which had plans to build a NASA space station on their land.
It's a classic case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. What other stories from the Pacific will we be exploring?
French-occupied Polynesia, now known as French Polynesia, was grappling with the ongoing nightmare of nuclear testing and the ever-increasing French colonial presence.
It's hard to believe they were still dealing with the fallout of nuclear testing.
It's beyond comprehension. The yearbook details demonstrations on Bikini Day, the health problems caused by radiation, and the French government's relentless efforts to tighten its grip on the islands.
Another example of colonial powers prioritizing their own interests over the well-being of indigenous peoples. It's a recurring theme, unfortunately. Were there any positive developments in the region?
There were some signs of progress. In Samoa, there was a surge in indigenous awareness, and the discriminatory 6-month visitor permits for Pacific Island peoples were finally abolished. It's a small but significant victory.
It's encouraging to see those small steps towards equality. What else does the yearbook highlight about the Pacific?
Palau, now known as Palau, was facing a major struggle over the Compact of Free Association with the United States and its nuclear-free constitution.
That conflict had been going on for a while, right?
Yeah. Yes, the U.S. was pushing hard for the compact, which would have allowed them to maintain a military presence and potentially store nuclear weapons on the islands. But the people of Palau were determined to uphold their nuclear-free constitution, a testament to their commitment to peace and environmental protection.
It's inspiring to see them standing up for their values, even in the face of such pressure. Were there any other political shakeups happening in the region?
Fiji experienced its first military coup, led by Colonel Rabuka, which was widely seen as a setback for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. The coup essentially reversed the results of the recent election, placing power back in the hands of the same people who held it before. It was a blow to democratic progress in the region.
Another case of powerful forces clinging to the status quo, even if it means undermining democracy. What about Kanaki, now New Caledonia? What was happening there in '87?
The fight for independence was a major issue in Kanaki. France held a referendum on independence, but it was boycotted by the Kanak people because France refused to address their demands for electoral reform. It was a clear attempt to manipulate the political process to maintain control.
It's a tactic that's been used time and again to silence dissenting voices. What other struggles were resonating across the Pacific at that time?
In the Solomon Islands, after years of international pressure, the British multinational Unilever finally withdrew from its logging operations. It was a major victory for environmental activists and indigenous communities who had been fighting against the company's destructive practices for years.
Those hard-fought victories against corporate greed are always inspiring. What about West Papua? What challenges were they facing?
West Papua was facing ongoing human rights violations under Indonesian occupation. The yearbook documents the displacement of the Doni people, forced assimilation policies, and the devastating impact of transmigration on indigenous communities. There were even reports of infected pigs being used as a form of biological warfare against the indigenous population.
That's horrific. It's hard to believe that such atrocities were happening in the 20th century.
I know, it's shocking. And sadly, as we'll see when we turn our attention to Australia and New Zealand, the struggle for indigenous rights was just as intense in those countries.
Well, on that somber note, let's head down under. What's our first stop on this leg of the journey?
Australia, where Aboriginal people were continuing their fight for land rights and self-determination, particularly in the Northern Territory. But the issue that truly gripped the nation in '87 was the alarming rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody.
That's an issue that continues to plague Australia today. What details does the yearbook provide about the situation back then?
It mentions a royal commission that was established to investigate the deaths of over 100 Aboriginal people in custody since 1980, with nearly 20 of those deaths occurring in 1987 alone. It's a truly horrifying statistic. The commission found that Aboriginal people were being imprisoned at 10 times the national rate, subjected to excessive force during arrest, and often denied adequate medical attention.
It's a shameful chapter in Australian history and a stark reminder of the systemic racism and injustice that Aboriginal people have faced and continue to face in Australia. Was there any news from New Zealand or Aotearoa, as it's also known in the yearbook?
While the yearbook does mention the ongoing struggle for Maori land rights and cultural recognition, the focus in this section is primarily on Australia.
It's clear that '87 was a pivotal year for Indigenous peoples in Australia, with both ongoing struggles and a growing movement for justice. Now, let's continue our global tour and head over to East Asia.
Sounds good. Our first stop is Japan, where the Ainu people were fighting for recognition as an indigenous minority. They were demanding the repeal of the Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act, which is incredibly outdated and discriminatory.
Can you tell us more about this act and why it was so problematic?
Well, it was originally enacted in the late 19th century, and it was presented as a way to protect the Ainu people. But in reality, it was a tool used to assimilate them and strip them of their land and cultural rights. By 1987, the Ainu were calling for a complete overhaul of the legal framework that governed their relationship with the Japanese government.
Another example of colonization disguised as protection. It's a story that's all too familiar. What other stories from East Asia stood out to you?
In Taiwan, indigenous people were protesting against the prostitution of Aboriginal women and fighting for land rights and cultural preservation. They were facing many of the same challenges as other indigenous groups around the world: exploitation, discrimination, and the erosion of their cultural heritage.
It's a reminder that these issues are sadly universal. What about Tibet? What was their situation like in '87?
Tibet was in the midst of an uprising against Chinese rule. A major point of contention was the influx of Chinese settlers into Tibet, which was leading to the marginalization of Tibetan culture and the loss of their traditional way of life. They were demanding greater autonomy and the preservation of their unique cultural identity.
It's a struggle that continues to this day. It seems like East Asia was a region grappling with complex issues of identity, cultural survival, and self-determination in 1987.
Absolutely. And as we'll see when we explore Southeast Asia, these themes are echoed throughout the region.
Well, let's continue our journey. What stories await us in Southeast Asia?
First stop is Thailand, where we find hill tribes facing assimilation and integration policies that threaten their traditional way of life. The Hong people were being forcibly relocated, and land losses due to tourism and logging were rampant.
It's heartbreaking to see how development so often comes at the expense of indigenous communities and their cultures.
It's a tragic pattern we see repeated around the world, and unfortunately, the situation in Burma, now known as Myanmar, was even more dire.
Okay, tell me more. What was happening in Burma in '87?
The conflict between the Karen people and the Burmese armed forces was escalating, and there were reports of U.S.-supplied herbicide 2004-D being used in chemical warfare against civilian populations. It's a horrifying example of how powerful nations can fuel conflicts that directly harm indigenous communities.
It's a reminder of the interconnectedness of these issues and how global politics can have devastating local consequences. What about other countries in Southeast Asia? Were there similar conflicts happening?
In Bangladesh, indigenous peoples in the Chittagong Hill Tracts were facing ongoing violence and human rights violations. Chakma refugees were fleeing to Tripura, India, to escape the violence, and there were reports of horrific massacres carried out by the army. The Garo people were also facing serious challenges in holding onto their land.
It sounds like Southeast Asia was a region rife with conflict and displacement in 1987. Were there any bright spots amidst all the turmoil?
Sadly, not many. In India, there were reports of violence against Naga villages in Nagaland, including killings, torture, and forced labor.
It's a truly bleak picture. It seems like almost everywhere we've looked, indigenous communities were facing immense challenges in 1987.
It was a difficult time, no doubt, but But amidst all the struggles, there were also signs of hope. Indigenous groups were organizing, mobilizing, and raising their voices on the international stage. And as we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive, that spirit of resistance was laying the groundwork for the Indigenous rights movement as we know it today.
Well, on that note, let's take a break and come back for the final leg of our journey. We'll explore how international advocacy efforts were taking shape in 1987 and what lessons we can learn from this glimpse into the past.
Welcome back. We've covered a lot of ground already in our exploration of the IWGIA Yearbook 1987, uncovering a truly heartbreaking, just tapestry of challenges faced by Indigenous peoples worldwide.
It's been a heavy but incredibly important journey so far. As we turn our attention to international advocacy efforts, I'm curious to see if there were any signs of hope emerging on a global scale in 87.
Absolutely. In fact, this is where we start to see the seeds of the modern Indigenous rights movement being sown. The UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations was gaining momentum, becoming this crucial platform for Indigenous peoples to voice their concerns, directly to the UN. They were contributing to the development of international standards for Indigenous rights, which was something that had been sorely lacking before.
It sounds like Indigenous peoples were finally starting to have their voices heard on the world stage. What were some of the specific issues the working group was focused on?
Well, they were tackling some of the most fundamental and persistent challenges that were facing Indigenous peoples, like land and resource rights, self-determination, and cultural survival. It was a space where Indigenous peoples could directly address the UN and demand recognition of their inherent rights, which was groundbreaking at the time.
It must have been incredibly empowering for Indigenous representatives to have that platform. Were there other international organizations working alongside the UN working group?
Yes, the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, or WCIP, was also playing a vital role in uniting Indigenous peoples from around the world. They advocated for their rights at the UN and other international forums, building solidarity and amplifying the call for justice.
It seems like 1987 was a year of growing international solidarity for Indigenous peoples. What about IWGIA itself? What role were they playing in all of this?
Well, IWGIA was doing what they do best, meticulously documenting Indigenous issues, providing support to Indigenous communities, and campaigning for their rights on a global stage. They were, and continue to be, this vital source of information and a powerful voice for Indigenous peoples worldwide.
It's amazing to see how much impact IWGIA has had over the years. The dedication to shining a light on these issues is truly inspiring. As we begin to wrap up our exploration of the IWGIA Yearbook 1987, what are some of the most significant takeaways that resonate with you?
I think the sheer scale of the injustices faced by Indigenous peoples it's overwhelming, even decades later. Land dispossession, cultural oppression, violence, environmental destruction, these were, and sadly still are, recurring themes in the Indigenous experience.
It's a painful reminder of the deep-rooted and systemic inequalities that continue to plague Indigenous communities worldwide. But amidst all the darkness, were there any glimmers of hope?
Absolutely. Amidst all the struggles, we also see these incredible examples of resilience, resistance, and importantly, a growing sense of international solidarity. Indigenous peoples were finding their voices, organizing, and demanding change on a global scale. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit.
And that's what gives me hope. The fight for Indigenous rights is far from over, but the seeds of that movement, they were clearly being planted back in 1987. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always potential for a brighter future.
You're absolutely right. Looking back at history like this, it reminds us of how far we've come, but also how much work is still left to be done. The IWGIA Yearbook 1987 it's a call to action, urging us to confront the legacy of colonialism and work towards a more just and sustainable world for Indigenous peoples.
So what does this all mean for us today? How can we apply these lessons from the past to the challenges we face in the present?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Are we doing enough to protect Indigenous rights and ensure their future? What role can we play as individuals and as a society in contributing to a more just and sustainable world for Indigenous peoples? These are questions worth pondering long after this deep dive ends.
Absolutely. We've only scratched the surface of what the IWGA Yearbook 1987 reveals about the complexities and urgency of Indigenous issues. But hopefully this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more and take action.
I hope so too. You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this episode, but there's always more to explore. We encourage you to check out IWGIA's website and their incredible archive of publications for a deeper understanding of Indigenous issues around the world.
And remember, the fight for Indigenous rights is a fight for all of us. It's a fight for justice, equality, and a sustainable future for our planet.
That's a great point. Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of many of the critical issues facing our world today, climate change, biodiversity loss, cultural preservation, you name it. Their voices and their knowledge are essential if we're going to create a better future for everyone.
So as we wrap up our journey through the IWGIA Yearbook 1987, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Think about this. The IWGIA Yearbook 1987, it's just one snapshot in time. It captures a particular moment in the long and ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights. But what about the stories that aren't captured in these pages? What about the countless acts of resistance, resilience, and cultural revitalization that are happening every day in Indigenous communities around the world? Those are the stories that give me hope, and I encourage you to seek them out, learn from them, and be inspired by them.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the IWGIA Yearbook 1987. We hope you've learned something new, been challenged, and been inspired to take action.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world for all.
We've journeyed across continents and delved into these regional struggles. We've witnessed the emergence of a global movement in our deep dive into the IWGIA Yearbook 1987.
Yeah.
It's been a powerful and eye-opening experience, to say the least.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this exploration, it's important to kind of zoom out and consider the bigger picture, What overarching themes and insights emerge from this snapshot of Indigenous experiences in 1987?
Okay. Yeah, I'm ready to connect the dots. What's the first thread that jumps out at you?
Well, the interconnectedness of Indigenous struggles worldwide is undeniable. Land dispossession, cultural oppression, environmental destruction, these issues, they transcend borders. They're linking Indigenous peoples across the globe in this shared experience.
It's like a global tapestry that's woven with these threads of resilience and resistance. And we saw that in 1987, Indigenous peoples were increasingly recognizing the power of collective action.
Precisely. The emergence of international organizations like the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations and the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, it marked a significant shift. These platforms, they provided Indigenous peoples with unprecedented opportunities to unite, amplify their voices, and demand recognition on a global stage.
It's fascinating to see how this movement was gaining momentum alongside another major global force, which was globalization. The world was becoming increasingly interconnected, and Indigenous peoples were on the front lines of that shift.
You're absolutely right. The yearbook provides the stark illustration of how globalization was playing out in Indigenous communities, often with devastating consequences. Land grabs by multinational corporations, displacement by mega projects, and the erosion of traditional cultures by mass media. These things were becoming increasingly common.
It's a reminder that globalization has this dual nature. It can connect people and cultures, but it can also exacerbate existing inequalities, especially for those who are already marginalized.
Exactly. And that's where the importance of recognizing and upholding Indigenous rights becomes so crucial. In 1987, we see the early stages of this global movement that's demanding that governments and international bodies recognize the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, rights to self-determination, land and resources, and cultural preservation.
A movement that continues to gain strength and momentum today.
Yeah.
What other lessons from 1987 resonate with you?
The critical role of information and documentation is something that really stands out. IWGIA's work in compiling and disseminating these reports, it was absolutely crucial in raising global awareness of Indigenous issues and holding governments and corporations accountable for their actions.
It's like they were shining a light into dark corners of the world, exposing injustices that were often hidden from view.
Exactly. And that's a lesson that's just as relevant today. In a world awash in information, it's more important than ever to have trusted sources like IWGIA providing accurate and nuanced perspectives on Indigenous issues, challenging dominant narratives, and amplifying the voices of those who are often silenced.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the IWGIA Yearbook 1987, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
Remember this. The fight for Indigenous rights is a fight for all of us. It's a fight for justice, for equality, and for a sustainable future for our planet. By listening to Indigenous voices, learning from their knowledge, and supporting their struggles, we can create a world that is more just, equitable, and sustainable for everyone.
Beautifully put. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the IWGIA Yearbook 1987. We hope you've been inspired, challenged, and left with a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of our world and the vital importance of upholding Indigenous rights.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world.